Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. We thought it would be apt and timely to re-agitate the conversation and discourse surrounding animal welfare and animal protection in Sri Lanka. As we all know, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Ordinance of 1907 is still the statute that is in operation. It's very much antiquated, outdated and archaic. There have been multiple conversations surrounding the animal welfare bill. However, it still hasn't made it to the order paper. It still hasn't been enacted into law. So to discuss the pivotal importance of having this enactment, of having a conversation surrounding animal rights and animal welfare, we've invited to our studios Dr. Jagath Gunawadena, attorney at law and environmental activist. Good evening and welcome, Doctor.
Good evening.
We've seen how time and time again countless governments have promised to enact the Animal Welfare Act. However, it still hasn't been prioritized, it still hasn't been done, and animals can't advocate for themselves, so it's important that human beings do. Speak to us about this crisis that exists.
The Animal Welfare Bill first came into discussion in 2005, and after some deliberation there was a consensus draft made in 2006, and it was brought before the Parliament at the committees, but it was never brought in as a bill to be debated in Parliament, so it went down after a while. And then in 2015, under the 100-day program, this was again mooted and discussed, and then after some time it again went down, and this time it was in 2022 that this bill was brought in again, and it is still under discussion by several groups and still not tabled in Parliament for debate. My personal position is, regardless of whatever the deficiencies this bill has, we have to first get this act going, and if there are any shortcomings or anything, then we will bring them as an amendment by clamoring for an amendment. But if we procrastinate with bringing this bill by looking at these provisions and finding fault with some minute detail, we will never have this law. This law, if brought, will have a new chapter in the subject of animal welfare, because the existing Cruelty to Animals Ordinance is a bill that gives negative rights to animals. That is, the rights are not spelled out, but the violation of certain things are deemed to be an offence. But in the welfare bill, there are certain welfare provisions that have to be done in treating captive and domesticated animals. So that is a quantum leap from the present day position, and that alone is sufficient to justify the new act. But as some people say, if there are any shortcomings in this draft, better not to discuss it and procrastinate the bill further and let it go down once again, but rather get it passed and then request amendments if there are any shortcomings in implementing it. So my position is, bring the bill before the Parliament and pass it into an act, and then we will see how it works and if there are any shortcomings. Rather than trying to be hypothetical at this stage, look at the practical situation when it is implemented and come up with necessary amendments if at all necessary.
Dr. Gunawadena, why do you think it is that this is being deprioritized so many times?
I think there is no political push to get this through. One reason is that animal rights are not in the agenda of many politicians, and the second thing is, it's not an issue where many people in this country seems to be much sensitive about. So if there is a big public pressure to bring this kind of legislation, I think the politicians will have a better way to tackle it. But right now it's only the personal interest of certain small number of members of Parliament which keeps this going, at least for the time being. So I am grateful and thankful for those members of Parliament who are interested in this, but I think if the larger group pushes it, it will be brought to the order paper and the other things will follow quickly, because there is no reason why this kind of a bill should be opposed And furthermore, in the eyes of the international community, we will look quite mature when we have some very good animal welfare laws in place, because it's another yardstick of measurement like the human rights situation. So animal rights itself is something that we can tout before the world if we have at least this new kind of legislation in place.
Animals are recognized as sentient beings and not just merely as chattel. Speak to us about what entails animal welfare, animal protection. Speak to us also about the fact that cruelty to animals also includes neglectful behavior. Just take us through that paradigm, Dr. Gunawadena.
If we take the existing Act, that is the Animal Cruelty to Animals Ordinance of 1907, last amended in 1955. It's a rather old amendment also, because the amendment itself precedes my birth. So during my lifetime there had been no amendment to it. But taking the whole thing into consideration, that Act itself has observed or recognized animals as sentient beings, and that is why cruelty is an offense, negligence is an offense. Now there are under section 3 and 2 of the present enactment certain things like overdriving an animal or exhausting an animal by getting it to work too much are also considered as offenses, and then again not providing it with adequate space, not providing it with adequate food and water, and tethering it in a manner that will be injurious to it, or at least cause inconvenience to animals, are all deemed to be offences. In addition, mutilating an animal or inflicting cruelty or pain into an animal is also an offense, and negligent act like not providing enough water, not giving food at adequate quantities or at the necessary times are all deemed to be offences. So wanton acts as well as negligence or disregard to the well-being of the animal are also offences under the present ordinance. So that itself shows that the animal is recognized as a sentient being, and certain rights are given to the animal, but the rights are not explicitly stated, but the Act says that the violation of these things would deem to be considered as an offense. So that itself shows that even the old Act, although it is more than a century old and more than half a century since its last amendment, is also recognizing certain rights of the animals, though not very clearly stated or explicitly stated as some people want. But we all know that in law there are certain things which are explicitly stated and there are certain things that are implicitly stated. So this is basically implicit way of giving rights to an animal and recognizing it as a living sentient being that can feel emotions. Another aspect of the present law is that not only the physical harm, but also putting it into certain kinds of pressures which will call psychological harm to the animal is also considered to be an offense. So that way this law, when you take the time of its enactment, it seems to be a progressive law during those days, but now the situation has changed, and now the world has moved from giving positive rights or welfare to animals rather than trying to find offences against animals, but offences are still there. But now the consideration is to give animals certain rights as welfare measures, and that is what this new bill is intended to provide.
Can you take us through the importance of the concept of having a duty of care when it comes to domesticated animals on the one hand, and what it's like with respect to animals in the wild? So in when it comes to domesticated animals, a person who is in charge of an animal has owes it a duty of care to take reasonable steps to ensure its well-being, to provide basic needs, to prevent infliction of unnecessary fear or harm. If you can take us through those two aspects.
Yeah, the two aspects are different. When it comes to captive and domesticated animals, they are under the authority of a human being or under the control of a human being. So it is, the animal is in a way helpless. The animal is in a way totally bound to the measures that are taken by the human being for its survival and welfare. Whereas in the case of wild animals, they are in the wild, and we have to take care on three aspects. One, to protect its habitat so that the animal may live in its natural environment. Second, the survival of the animal as a species. And the third aspect is to prevent any unwanted things which are deemed to be illegal from happening to these animals and their habitats.
Right.
So in the case of wild animals, it's a totally different set of rights that we observe. When it's in the case of the domesticated and captive animals, I will put the two categories together because not all animals under human care are domesticated animals. There are certain captive animals like the captive elephants. So when it comes to captive animals and domesticated animals, since they are under the control of the human being, the rights and the wrongs are different from what we intend in the wild. In the wild, we look at the survival of the species and its habitat basically, whereas in the Animal Welfare Bill and the Cruelty to Animals Ordinance, we look at the individual animal in a different context.
And when it comes to animals in the wild, the key institution that is vested with the responsibility of ensuring protection of wildlife is the Wildlife Conservation Department, as well as, of course, the ministry. Over the past several years, we've heard of countless instances of animals in the wild being disturbed by certain parties, the safari jeeps, to the human-elephant conflict, all sorts of incidents being reported of late. Isn't the existing set of laws sufficient to protect against these wrongs?
There are three aspects that we have to broadly look at. One is the laws and the regulations, and the relevant law is the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, and the regulations are made under it on certain things. The second is the institutional mechanism that is there to enforce the law. The third is the amount of attention paid by the general public, not the public awareness, but the attention and interest shown by the public. When it comes to the law, the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance was last amended in 2009, and that amendment has brought the law forward by leaps and bounds, but unfortunately during these past 14 years we have seen that it is not implemented satisfactorily in the ground. Many causes prevent it being implemented in the ground. One cause is that the Department of Wildlife is woefully inadequate when it comes to the staff. The department doesn't have more than 1,000 people in the field, but for a proper enforcement of this, we need about 9,000 people in the field. At least 2/3 of it is 6,000. So we at least have to increase this cadre strength by another 5,000 people, at least if we want to see some effective protection. That is the institutional aspect. Then there are other institutions that can help the wildlife department, like the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Department, the Forest Department, and the police on certain aspects, as well as the customs on certain aspects. So there should be a amalgamated, coordinated network amongst these institutions to ameliorate this deficiency, at least to a certain extent, and it is not yet happening, but there is a mechanism being proposed and there are discussions going on about it to bring these departments and institutions into a coordinated working relationship so that one can strengthen the activities of another. For instance, take the case of marine mammals, which are totally protected under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. There are fisheries officials all around the coast, so they can at least do part of the enforcement on behalf of the Wildlife Department. Then there is the Coast Guard and the Navy, which also can play a role, and there is the police. So they have a presence all around the country more or less, and they can help enhance the effectiveness of protecting these kinds of animals. Same with the elephants. This is the way that we think is a way forward, because under the present financial crisis we are not in a position to ask for a great increase in the cadre strength of these departments. We have to look at the other aspects of the government and the country also, when we propose certain things, of course we can and we should say that the departmental strength has to be increased, but it has to be done gradually according to the circumstances. But the pressing need of the hour is to have much more effective enforcement, and there are other ways of doing it in this developed communication age, unlike in the past. So at least we should look at these things rather than finding fault and be desperate about the situation. The third aspect is the public should be more informed, more interested, more involving in the protection of the environment. Let me just add something different. Every one of us, every citizen of this country owes a duty and obligation to protect the environment, and that duty and obligation comes from Article 28F of the Constitution. So if they exercise their constitutional right, at least to a certain extent, so many things can be rectified. So we need more involvement from the public. Mere awareness and passivity on the part of the public as it is today will not help further these causes very much.
All right, thank you. That was very comprehensive. Dr. Gunawadena, we also need to speak about the role of legislative enactments and interventions and its role in curbing abuses against animals, meaning that there needs to be greater punitive measures to ensure that cruelty to animals, the instances are restricted and limited and curtailed. So what do you have to say about the fact that when it comes to the punitive measures for animal cruelty, they are abysmal according to the current legislative enactments?
It depends on several factors, or what we call several variables. The first is the charges that are placed for the criminal activities, how the charges are framed, and the second thing is how many of the charges are proven in the court, and the third and the fourth aspect is the discretion of the court and the provisions in the enactment. So the provisions in the enactment itself is of course an issue, but there are certain things in the present cruelty to animals ordinance that if we take it into consideration and if we make our submissions and if we make our charges relevant to these things, then the court may issue a much better order rather than impose a fine and forget about it.
Right.
For instance, there are provisions in this act which says that the court can even order the destruction of an animal if the animal had been subjected to cruelty to a certain extent. But I interpret it to mean that the court can make any order, not only for the destruction but any other order to place the animal in safe hands. So my question is, in how many cases does the prosecution or the intervenient party ask the court for such an order? If asked, at least we can know how the court will look at these provisions. So there are certain things in the present act we have not invoked, but we had tried it and been successful in the past, which should be gainfully invoked by the courts for the betterment of the animals. Rather than giving it back to the person, we can always request that the animal be placed in the hands of a third party. But when it comes to an animal like the elephant, which is in the custody of private parties, not owned as a dog or a cat, then this provision comes very handily. If the person is not suitable to keep the animal in a good condition, then the court can always make an order to get that animal back into the hands of the wildlife department.
Right. Dr. Gunawadena, animals don't live in a vacuum. They live in a very complex ecosystem. Let's talk about the biodiversity aspect of ensuring that there's a holistic ecosystem created for animals. We know that there are issues with human beings encroaching upon, usurping upon habitats of animals. There is very little understanding that we need to coexist with the animal kingdom. Speak to us about this whole aspect.
That is the very same approach that we are taking, rather than taking animals, plants and ecosystems as three different things. We tend to look at the whole thing as one holistic system, and that is how it operates in nature. And I am happy that this question was framed in that manner so that I can answer it from what I call the ecosystem approach. We look at the ecosystem not as individual species or individual habitats. When it comes to the ecosystem, we know that the ecosystem is a complex system where there are innumerable interactions between living organisms with one another, and the living organisms with the physical environment like the water, the soil, the air, and other aspects which causes different changes. So these creatures, big and small, play a vital role in maintaining this complex system known as the ecosystem. Any small change in a complex system may sometimes lead into big unwanted results, and that is what a scientist by the name of Lawrence showed way back in 1965. But more than half a century later, we still are unable to grasp what Lawrence showed in 1965. His paper's title is now used as a cliché by some people who says that flapping of a butterfly wings in Amazon would cause a tornado in Texas. But the context of his statement or the validity of it is to say that a small change happening in one part of a complex system will bring a catastrophic result on another place. And that is exactly what we are trying to avert, and that is exactly the situations which we try to prevent, because we never know what will the consequences of doing some changes into a complex system will ultimately bring about. And most people, including some higher ups in the authorities as well as the politicians, the top bureaucrats, sometimes don't understand the difference between a complex system and how a complex system operates and a complicated system. Of course, they know what a complicated system and think that the complex system is also a complicated system, but it is not. In a complicated system, we know the arrangement of the different parts, so we can predict, we can know what will be the consequences of an action. But in a complex system, we never know what the consequences will be. It will be nil, absolutely nothing, or it will be catastrophic. Now, there are so many examples. The large flocks of starlings flying all over USA are a good example of unwanted introduction of a European bird into the American continent. They never thought that the starling will become such a big menace to the American ecosystem. These large flocks are like a cloud. Sometimes it's very nice to look, but the consequences are not that nice. Then there is this issue of toad known as the cane toad that was introduced to Australia to curb a beetle which is plaguing the sugarcane industry. And what happened is now half of Australia is under the threat of this frog or the toad, which is rapidly proliferating and eating its way through the ecosystems of Australia. So these are the catastrophic effects of one unwanted action. The same thing will happen if a living organism, whether it's a plant or an animal, is removed. We never know how the whole system will break down by the removal of one pivotal species in the ecosystem. And unless and until we remove such a species from the system, we never know which species is playing the pivotal role in holding the system. So this is why we always say that every living being in an ecosystem plays a vital role, and since we don't know exactly what role is played by what organism, better to leave them all alone or to ensure their survival. And that's what the message of conservation that we are delivering or imparting to the society. The ecosystem is complex, and we too, human beings, are also part of this complex ecosystem. We all know how a virus bordering on the living and the non-living played havoc with our lives, and we were unable to tackle it until we brought in vaccines. But then the other thing is the vaccines are prodding our own defense mechanism, not a solution from the outside. So we never know what will strike us the next day and what will be our responses, or whether we will survive the next catastrophe or we will also go down with the other species. So that's why we want the society to look at this as a complex system And since we can't understand it, respect it at least, let it be, rather than facing a catastrophe by trying to tinker with it and meddle with it without knowing what it is. And this is exactly what the Panchatantra and the Hitopadesha are also showing us for thousands of years, not to meddle in things that you don't understand.
I'd like to connect your answer to my next question, which is that we must talk about Sri Lanka's tendency to engage in short-sighted developmental projects which don't have proper environmental clearances. The environmental impact assessments are ignored. This keeps happening throughout.
Yes. I tend to look at it from a different perspective than what is meant in the environmental impact assessment. In the EIA, we look at how to ameliorate or mitigate the environmental problems arising from a project. I want it to be seen in a more holistic manner, to take an ecosystem approach and see whether the system can withstand this change, whether the system can rebound from this amount of damage, whether the system can absorb this damage and yet survive and get the services that are expected from the system. But unfortunately, the EIA itself has now become another useless tool, because some people think that the EIA is there to give approval to the project, whereas the EIA is to look at the different alternatives that are mooted for a project and come up with the most environmentally healthy or environmentally sustainable alternative out of the lot. And the other sad thing is that EIA is not the only type of approval that is needed for a new project, but there are other types of approval that are needed, and that there are other types of things that need to be seen. And after several decades of having the environmental impact assessment that is done for projects, now there is another tool called the strategic environment assessment that looks at the whole area, a whole issue in its totality, and come up with suitable measures before things get out of hand. So there will be an environmental impact assessment for a particular project, but when it comes to a district or a province, a strategic environmental assessment can be made to look at the areas that need to be given for development, the areas that should be left for conservation, the areas that should be given for agriculture, the areas that had to be used for housing projects and human habitations, like that. So we don't look at it from the narrow scope of a project, but you take the whole total picture into consideration and think beforehand what should be done where and what should be not done where. And that is one different or novel approach to this whole problem, but there are other tools also that are in use. And another thing that we need to take into consideration is the ecological red listing, that is to see how much the different ecosystems are prone to collapse. Now, collapse of ecosystems is the catastrophe that can await us in the future, and to avert that, the IUCN and certain other bodies have come up with a scheme of giving a certain categorization to the ecosystems by looking at its fragility or collapsibility. So we have never utilized this tool in Sri Lanka as yet. And the third is to look at the ecosystem services provided by the different ecosystems and see and ensure that whatever the development activity that happens will not impede the ecological services or the ecosystem services. So these are new tools we need to look at in the near future.
Okay, fantastic. My final question, we have just 2 minutes on the show. How important is it for the public to educate themselves on protecting the environment, on ensuring animal welfare and protection, to protect the ecosystem and biodiversity in Sri Lanka?
I think everyone has to learn some of these new concepts together with the catastrophes that are awaiting us in the scale of the whole world, or in the scale of the country, or in the regional context. The second thing and the most important thing I want to impress upon everyone is that protecting the environment is a duty and obligation of everyone, and that is provided in Article 28, Subarticle F of the Constitution itself. So stand up and do your part. A few people who are known as environmentalists because of their activism, or environmental activists because of their activism, can't compensate for the silent majority. So the silent majority has to detach themselves from the silence that they are exhibiting right now and join the cause in protecting this country for the sake of their next generations.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Jagath Gunawadena, attorney at law and environmental activist. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and expertise, and thank you, Doctor, for also tirelessly working on this area of law and advocacy. Throughout several decades you've been working on this area. It does make a difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next week with the Sinhala edition of the program. Have a safe weekend. Good night.